If someone is confident enough to sue you, make sure they have actually read the map first. At 6:17 that morning, 45 luxury villas went silent. Not because of a storm, not because of a power outage, not because of some construction accident. They went silent because a judge had signed a piece of paper the day before, and now county deputies were standing at the entrance gate making sure that order was followed. I watched everything from the top of a low ridge overlooking my ranch. The sunrise spread across the Montana Valley in shades of gold and orange. The air smelled like pine trees, dry grass, and cold morning dew. Below me, a line of luxury SUVs sat motionless outside the villa development. Residents stepped out of their vehicles looking confused. Maintenance workers gathered near the entrance. Property managers checked their phones repeatedly. Nobody seemed to understand why the gates were closed. The answer was sitting inside a courthouse file less than 10 miles away. 2 deputies stood calmly near the entrance. A temporary notice had been secured beside the gate. They were professional, patient, and completely uninterested in anyone's opinion about the situation. Their job was simple: enforce the order. By 6:30, the first arguments had started. By 6:45, the crowd had doubled. Then Linda Crawford arrived. Even from a distance, I recognized her immediately. She stepped out of a black luxury SUV wearing a white jacket and expensive sunglasses despite the early hour. For years, she had been the most powerful voice inside the homeowners association. Residents listened when she spoke. Contractors followed her instructions. Board members rarely challenged her decisions. She walked toward the deputies with the confidence of someone who expected a misunderstanding to be corrected immediately. What she found instead was a reality she could no longer control. One deputy handed her a copy of the court order. She scanned the pages. Then she read them again. Her expression changed so quickly that even from the ridge I could see it happen. Confidence became confusion. Confusion became disbelief. Around her, residents demanded explanations. Questions echoed across the entrance road. Why was the property closed? What happened? How long would this last? Nobody seemed to have answers. Linda certainly did not. The strange part was that none of this should have been a surprise. For months, warning signs had been piling up. Survey reports, property records, county documents, legal notices. Every one of them pointed toward the same uncomfortable possibility. Yet nobody wanted to believe it, especially Linda. The villa project had become the crown jewel of the association. 45 luxury homes sat on a beautifully developed section of land surrounded by rolling hills and open ranch country. The community marketed the villas as a symbol of success. Real estate brochures featured them prominently. Property tours always included them. Investors loved them. Residents were proud of them. Linda treated them like proof that her leadership worked. What nobody realized was that the land beneath those villas carried a secret buried inside decades of paperwork. My name is Grant Holloway. I am 48 years old, and until 2 years earlier, I had never even heard of this development. I purchased thousands of acres of ranch land from a family that had owned the property for generations. My plan was simple: raise cattle, improve the land, enjoy a quieter life. I had no interest in fighting with a homeowners association. I had no interest in luxury villas. I certainly had no interest in courtrooms. But somewhere between the ranch I purchased and the development everyone admired, a mistake had been hiding for years. A mistake so large that it eventually reached a judge's desk. And by the time the deputies arrived at those gates, that mistake had become impossible to ignore. When I bought the ranch, I thought I understood exactly what I was getting. The property stretched across thousands of acres of rolling Montana grassland bordered by pine-covered ridges and narrow streams that cut through the valleys. The previous owners had held the land for nearly 70 years. Their family history was tied to every fence line, every grazing field, and every weathered barn scattered across the property. I spent months reviewing records before the purchase was finalized. Water rights, grazing leases, mineral reports, access easements. The transaction was large enough that every detail mattered. By the time the closing documents were signed, I believe there were no surprises left. Looking back, that assumption almost sounds funny. The first few months after moving in were exactly what I had hoped for. My mornings started before sunrise. I would drink coffee on the porch while fog drifted across the lower fields. The smell of damp grass mixed with pine needles carried through the cool mountain air. Cattle moved slowly across distant pastures while hawks circled overhead. After years spent managing business operations and negotiating contracts, the routine felt almost therapeutic. Most days were simple. Repair a fence, inspect a water tank, meet with ranch workers, review improvement plans. The homeowners association barely crossed my mind. I knew it existed because parts of the development bordered sections of my property, but our interactions were practically non-existent. That changed one afternoon during a routine inspection of the southern boundary. I was riding with an old ranch manager named Caleb Morrison. Caleb had worked the region for decades and knew the landscape better than most survey maps. We were checking fencing conditions after a series of heavy storms when he pointed toward a distant cluster of buildings visible across a rise. "Those villas keep getting closer every year," he said casually. At first I laughed. The structures looked nowhere near the ranch boundary. The villa development occupied a beautifully landscaped section of land with paved roads, decorative lighting, and rows of upscale homes. Everything appeared professionally planned. Everything appeared permanent. But Caleb did not laugh. Instead, he reached behind the truck seat and pulled out an old folded map he kept for reference. The paper was worn from years of use. Several corners had been repaired with tape. He spread it across the hood of the truck and pointed toward a section near the development. "I always thought this line looked strange," he said. The comment stayed with me long after we finished the inspection. That evening, I retrieved copies of the survey documents I received during the purchase process. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I compared the newer maps against several historical records included in the property archive. One line did not match. Then another. The discrepancies were small, but they all appeared in the same area, near the villas. Over the next week, curiosity slowly turned into concern. I contacted a survey company and requested a review of several boundary markers. There was no conflict yet, no accusations, no legal questions, just a desire to verify the information. The survey crews arrived 3 days later. Bright flags appeared across portions of the southern boundary. Measurement equipment was set up near fence lines. Coordinates were checked and rechecked. Everything seemed routine until one surveyor stopped beside a weathered boundary marker partially hidden by tall grass. I remember him kneeling beside it for several minutes before calling the rest of the crew over. From where I stood, I could not hear what they were discussing, but I could see their expressions. Something had caught their attention, something important. At that moment, I had no idea a forgotten marker buried in the grass was about to connect my ranch to 45 luxury villas and eventually place the entire development under the attention of a judge. The villa development looked like something from a luxury resort brochure. From a distance, the 45 homes sat perfectly against the landscape, their stone facades glowing in the afternoon sun, while neatly maintained roads curved between manicured lawns and decorative trees. Small ponds reflected the mountains in the distance. Walking trails connected gathering areas. A large clubhouse overlooked the valley. Every detail projected success. Every detail projected permanence. That was exactly why nobody questioned it. During the weeks following the survey crew's discovery, I found myself paying closer attention to the development than ever before. What I saw only made the situation more complicated. Families lived there. Retirees spent evenings on covered patios. Contractors maintained landscaping. Delivery trucks arrived throughout the day. The villas were not an abandoned project or a half-finished construction site. They were a functioning neighborhood filled with people who believed they belonged exactly where they were. The more I observed, the more I understood why the homeowners association valued the development so highly. It was easily the most impressive asset connected to the community. Property listings highlighted it. Marketing materials featured photographs of it. Real estate agents proudly pointed to it during tours. The villas represented growth, prestige, and revenue. At the center of all that stood Linda Crawford. I met her for the first time at a community event held near the clubhouse. The evening air carried the smell of grilled food and fresh-cut grass. Residents gathered around outdoor seating areas while children played nearby. Soft music drifted across the property. Linda moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone completely comfortable being in charge. She greeted residents by name. She shook hands with contractors. She answered questions without hesitation. Watching her interact with people, it became obvious why she had remained influential for so long. She projected certainty. People trusted certainty. At one point, she stood before a large display showing future plans for the villa community. Expansion concepts. Infrastructure improvements. Additional amenities. Residents listened attentively while she explained the association's vision. Then she pointed toward the villas themselves and described them as one of the community's greatest accomplishments. Everyone applauded. Standing near the edge of the crowd, I felt an uncomfortable realization settle in. If the survey findings proved correct, the issue was far larger than a misplaced fence or an inaccurate map. Entire decisions had been built upon assumptions that might not survive scrutiny. A few days later, the survey company delivered additional reports. I spread the documents across a long table inside the ranch house. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows while thunder rolled through the mountains. The updated measurements aligned almost perfectly with several historical boundary references. More importantly, they aligned with portions of the original deed descriptions. The same area kept appearing, the same section of land, the same villa development. By now, coincidence was becoming difficult to believe. I contacted additional professionals to review the findings independently. Surveyors, title specialists, land use consultants. None of them knew one another. None had a reason to influence the outcome. Yet each review moved in the same direction. The development appeared closer to my ranch boundaries than anyone had realized. Some portions appeared alarmingly close. One consultant stared at the maps for nearly 10 minutes before finally speaking. "You need to know exactly what the original records say," he told me. "Because if these lines are correct, somebody made a very expensive assumption." Sitting alone at the ranch house that evening, surrounded by maps and property records, I looked out across the dark valley toward the distant lights of the villa community. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, stable, untouchable. Yet buried beneath those lights was a question nobody had asked for years. And before long, that question was going to demand an answer. The boundary marker became the center of everything. 3 days after the latest survey reports arrived, I drove back to the southern section of the ranch with the survey team to examine the area again. Morning sunlight stretched across the grasslands while a cold breeze moved through the tall pine trees lining the valley. The marker itself looked insignificant. It was an aging steel post partially hidden beneath weeds and decades of accumulated dirt. Most people would have walked past it without a second glance. Yet every coordinate, every historical reference, and every measurement kept leading back to that exact location. One surveyor carefully cleared the surrounding vegetation, while another compared readings against digital mapping equipment. The process took nearly 2 hours. When they finally finished, nobody looked surprised anymore. They looked concerned. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a title specialist reviewing historical land records. He wanted to meet in person. That alone told me something unusual had surfaced. We met inside a small office near the county records building. The room smelled like paper, coffee, and old filing cabinets. Large maps covered the conference table. Deed copies sat stacked beside survey reports. The specialist pointed toward a collection of documents dating back several decades. One by one, he walked me through ownership transfers, boundary descriptions, and development filings connected to the region. Most of the information was routine. Then we reached a section involving the land beneath the villa project. That was where things started becoming strange. Several later development documents appeared to assume property boundaries that did not fully match the earlier deed descriptions. It was not an obvious error. In fact, it was subtle enough that many people would never notice it. But once the discrepancy appeared, it became impossible to ignore. The original records consistently pointed toward one conclusion, while some later assumptions pointed toward another. The title specialist leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "You need to understand something," he said. "If the original chain of title controls this area the way it appears to, then this issue is much larger than a simple boundary disagreement." I drove home that evening with a copy of every relevant document in my truck. The sun was setting behind the mountains by the time I reached the ranch house. Inside, I spread the records across the dining table and began comparing them myself. Hour after hour, I followed the paper trail backward through time. Original deeds, survey references, historical plats, development filings. Every path led toward the same uncomfortable possibility. Portions of the villa development appeared to occupy land that had never been properly separated from the ranch property described in the original ownership records. The realization sat heavily in the room. Outside, wind rattled the windows while darkness settled across the valley. In the distance, I could see the lights of the villa community glowing against the hillside. Families were eating dinner. Residents were watching television. People were living normal lives, completely unaware that questions were forming beneath the foundations of the neighborhood around them. The next morning, I authorized a full independent boundary review from another surveying firm. I wanted confirmation from professionals with no connection to the earlier findings. If they reached a different conclusion, I would accept it. If they reached the same conclusion, the situation would become impossible to dismiss. A week later, their preliminary findings arrived. I remember opening the report while standing on the porch overlooking the ranch. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and approaching rain. As I turned each page, the pattern repeated itself once again. Different surveyors, different equipment, different review process. Same result. The forgotten marker in the grass had not been wrong. The maps had not been wrong. The records had not been wrong. For the first time since buying the ranch, I realized the question was no longer whether a problem existed. The question was how the homeowners association would react when they finally learned what the land itself had been saying all along. Once the second survey confirmed the findings, I knew the next step could not be avoided. The homeowners association needed to see the evidence. Not rumors, not opinions, actual documents. A week later, I requested a formal meeting with association leadership. The invitation was accepted surprisingly quickly. Looking back, I think they assumed the discussion would be brief. They believed they already knew the outcome. The meeting took place inside the villa clubhouse on a clear afternoon. Sunlight poured through large windows overlooking landscaped grounds and walking paths. Residents relaxed on nearby patios while maintenance crews worked around decorative flower beds. The atmosphere felt peaceful, almost detached from the issue about to be discussed. Inside the conference room, Linda Crawford sat at the head of a polished wooden table surrounded by board members, property managers, and legal representatives connected to the association. Large photographs of the villa community decorated the walls. Looking around the room, it was obvious how much pride everyone took in the project. I understood that. The development was beautiful. Unfortunately, beauty has never changed property boundaries. I presented the survey findings carefully. First, the independent survey results, then the title reviews, then the historical records and chain of title analysis. I explained how multiple professionals working independently had reached nearly identical conclusions. I showed maps comparing original boundary descriptions with current assumptions. Several board members studied the documents seriously. A few even asked thoughtful questions. Linda did not. She remained remarkably calm throughout the presentation. When I finished speaking, she glanced at the paperwork for only a few moments before sliding it aside. Then she smiled. It was the same confident smile I remembered from the community event. "Grant," she said, "these homes have been here for years." I nodded. "I know. Families live here. I know. The association has maintained this property the entire time. I know." She leaned back in her chair. "Then I think we both understand there is no real issue." The room became very quiet. For a moment, I wondered whether she genuinely believed what she was saying or simply refused to consider the alternative. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Every time I referenced deeds, surveys, or historical plats, Linda responded with community history and long-standing expectations. Every factual question seemed to receive an emotional answer. Every document was met with confidence rather than analysis. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that no agreement would be reached. I left the clubhouse feeling disappointed but not surprised. What happened next surprised me. 3 weeks later, I received legal papers. Linda and the Homeowners Association had filed a lawsuit. The claim essentially argued that the development's existence, community reliance, and long-term use outweighed the concerns raised by my surveys and property records. I remember reading the complaint at my kitchen table while rain tapped against the ranch house windows. Outside, clouds drifted across the mountains. Inside, I kept returning to the same thought. They had chosen court, not investigation, not mediation. Court. The irony was impossible to ignore. The one place where assumptions mattered least was the place Linda had chosen to fight. As the lawsuit moved forward, attorneys began exchanging records and documentation. Requests were filed. Historical surveys were examined. Additional property records surfaced. The deeper everyone looked, the larger the paper trail became. Yet Linda remained publicly confident. Community newsletters reassured residents that the association would prevail. Board meetings continued. Development plans moved forward. It was as if the lawsuit itself had become proof that she was right. Standing on the ranch one evening watching the lights of the villa community glow against the dark hillside, I realized something important. The legal battle was no longer about convincing Linda. That phase had ended. Now the evidence would speak for itself. And unlike confidence, evidence does not care who believes in it. The lawsuit opened doors that neither side could control. Once the court became involved, records that had remained buried in filing cabinets for decades suddenly became relevant. Attorneys requested documents. Surveyors submitted reports. County offices produced archived materials. Every week seemed to reveal another piece of the story. What surprised me most was not what we found. It was how long the information had been sitting there waiting for someone to read it. One morning, my attorney called and asked me to meet him at the county records office. His tone was calm, but there was something underneath it that immediately caught my attention. By noon, I was seated inside a conference room surrounded by stacks of historical files. The room smelled like paper, dust, and old wood. Large plat maps covered an entire wall. Several county employees moved quietly between filing cabinets while attorneys reviewed documents spread across a long table. My attorney slid a folder toward me. "You need to see this," he said. Inside were copies of development records connected to the villa project. Some dated back more than 20 years. Others were newer. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed a pattern. Several filings referenced assumptions about property boundaries, but very few appeared to trace those assumptions back to the original chain of title. The deeper we looked, the more obvious the gap became. Important conclusions had been repeated from document to document without anyone fully verifying the foundation beneath them. It was like watching generations of paperwork inherit the same mistake. Later that week, another discovery emerged. County archive staff located a collection of historical plats that had not been included in several later development summaries. These older records aligned remarkably well with the surveys commissioned after I purchased the ranch. They also aligned with the original deed descriptions. Most importantly, they did not align with the boundaries the homeowners association had been treating as established fact. I remember staring at the maps while tracing lines with my finger. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Every independent source seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The villa development occupied land that had never been properly separated from the property described in my ownership records. As document production continued, the atmosphere around the case slowly changed. At first, association representatives projected confidence. Public statements remained optimistic. Community updates reassured residents that everything was under control. Then the questions started becoming more specific. Homeowners wanted to know what the surveys actually said. They wanted to know what the historical plats showed. They wanted to know whether the board had ever commissioned a complete title review before supporting the development. Those questions spread through the community faster than any official statement could contain. Meanwhile, Linda continued defending the association's position. She attended meetings. She spoke with residents. She insisted the lawsuit would resolve the issue. Yet every time new records appeared, the conversation became more difficult for her. Facts have a way of narrowing the available explanations. One afternoon, during a document review session, a land records specialist summarized the situation in a single sentence. "The land has been consistent," he said. "The assumptions changed." That observation stayed with me, because it perfectly captured what was happening. The ranch had not moved. The boundaries had not moved. The historical records had not changed. Only the story people told themselves about the land had changed. By the time discovery was nearing completion, one thing had become clear. The lawsuit Linda believed would end the dispute had done exactly the opposite. It had forced every document into the open. It had invited experts to review decades of records. And it had created a paper trail leading directly toward a courtroom where assumptions would finally have to compete with evidence. The courtroom was smaller than most people imagine when they think about a case capable of affecting an entire community. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouting, no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors at the last moment. What filled the room instead were maps, surveys, deeds, and years of paperwork stacked neatly on tables waiting to be examined. The hearing began on a gray morning with rain falling lightly outside the courthouse windows. I arrived early with my attorney and a collection of records that had followed us through months of litigation. Across the room sat Linda Crawford, association representatives, and their legal team. For the first time since this process began, Linda looked different. Not defeated. Not yet. But less certain. The confidence that once seemed automatic now appeared forced. As proceedings began, the judge moved quickly through the history of the dispute. Survey findings, property descriptions, historical plats, development records, discovery materials. Every major piece of evidence had already been reviewed before the hearing. What remained was determining which interpretation best matched the documented facts. Expert witnesses testified first. Surveyors explained measurement methods and boundary verification procedures. Title specialists described chain of title reviews and historical ownership records. County officials discussed archived plats and development filings. Listening from my seat, I noticed something important. The testimony coming from different professionals sounded remarkably similar. Different backgrounds, different careers, different perspectives. Yet the same conclusion continued appearing. The underlying property records pointed in one direction. Midway through the hearing, the judge focused attention on a series of historical maps displayed on large presentation screens. The room became noticeably quieter. These were not recent documents prepared for the lawsuit. They were records created decades earlier, long before any current board member became involved and long before I purchased the ranch. Their age gave them unusual weight. One by one, the maps were compared against deed descriptions, survey coordinates, and development filings. The overlap became difficult to ignore. Then came the moment I remember most clearly. The judge looked toward the association's legal team and asked a simple question. If the homeowners association possessed a valid document permanently granting rights to the land beneath the disputed portions of the development, where was it? The question hung in the room. Attorneys reviewed files. Additional documents were referenced. Explanations were offered. Yet no document matching the judge's request appeared. Not because nobody searched for it. People had been searching for months. The problem was that the record simply did not seem to exist. I glanced toward Linda. For the first time, she was no longer looking at the judge. She was looking down at the documents spread across the table in front of her. The hearing continued for several more hours. Legal arguments were presented. Technical details were discussed. Yet the central issue never changed. The court was not deciding who felt more confident. It was deciding what the records actually showed. By late afternoon, the judge announced that a written ruling would follow after final review of the evidence. Everyone stood as the session concluded. Outside, rain continued falling across the courthouse steps. Reporters were not waiting outside. Television cameras were not present. The moment felt surprisingly ordinary considering how much depended on it. Still, as I walked toward my truck, I sensed the case had reached a turning point. Months earlier, Linda believed filing the lawsuit would force me to back down. Instead, the lawsuit had exposed every assumption to scrutiny. Every survey had been examined. Every historical record had been reviewed. Every unanswered question had been brought into the open. Now the decision rested with the one person in the process who cared only about the evidence. And somewhere inside a stack of deeds, plats, and survey reports, the future of 45 villas was waiting for that decision to arrive. The ruling arrived 11 days later. I remember the exact moment because I was repairing a section of fence on the western side of the ranch when my phone rang. The afternoon sky was clear, and the scent of sun-warmed pine drifted across the hills. For a few seconds, I simply listened as my attorney summarized the decision. Then I looked out across the open grasslands and realized the entire situation had finally crossed from uncertainty into reality. The court had ruled in favor of the documented property records. The surveys, historical plats, deed descriptions, and chain of title evidence had prevailed. More importantly, the court authorized enforcement measures regarding the disputed portions of the villa development pending resolution of the ownership issues identified during litigation. The legal language was careful and precise. The impact was anything but small. Within hours, notifications were distributed to relevant parties. Attorneys received copies. County officials received copies. Association representatives received copies. By the following evening, rumors had already begun circulating through the community. Residents exchanged messages online. Phone calls spread from household to household. Some people refused to believe the reports. Others immediately started requesting information. For the first time since the dispute began, uncertainty shifted away from me and landed squarely on the homeowners association. The next morning, county officials coordinated implementation of the court's directives. Everything unfolded professionally and without drama. Temporary notices were prepared. Administrative procedures were followed. Deputies were assigned to oversee compliance where required. It was not a spectacle. It was a process. Yet the visual impact proved impossible to ignore. Before sunrise, county vehicles arrived near the villa entrance. By the time the first residents began leaving for work, official notices had already been posted. People slowed their vehicles to read them. Others parked and gathered in small groups. Conversations broke out across sidewalks, driveways, and community gathering areas. Questions filled the air. What exactly had happened? How could this occur? Why had nobody identified the problem years earlier? As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger. Homeowners wanted explanations. Contractors wanted instructions. Property managers wanted guidance. The one thing everyone seemed to want most was certainty. Unfortunately, certainty had become difficult to provide. Around mid-morning, Linda Crawford arrived. The moment felt strangely familiar. Months earlier, she had stood before residents projecting complete confidence in the association's position. This time was different. She moved through the crowd answering questions, but the answers sounded less certain than before. People wanted facts. They wanted documents. They wanted timelines. Many of the same homeowners who once accepted reassurances now demanded evidence. Standing near the edge of the gathering, I realized the court ruling had done more than address a property dispute. It had changed the conversation. Assumptions were no longer enough. Throughout the day, deputies remained calm and professional while overseeing compliance with the court's directives. Residents came and went. Attorneys spoke with officials. Community leaders held meetings. Yet beneath all the activity, one truth remained impossible to escape. The documents had won. Not because they were dramatic. Not because they were emotional. Because they were accurate. As evening approached, the atmosphere around the villa development felt completely different from the confident environment I had first encountered months earlier. The landscaped roads were still beautiful. The homes were still standing. The mountain views remained breathtaking. Yet an invisible foundation had shifted. The belief that everything had been settled was gone. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and shadows stretched across the valley, I drove back toward the ranch. In my rearview mirror, I could still see people gathered near the entrance discussing what had happened. For years, the development had been treated as an unquestioned success story. Now everyone was discovering that success built on an unchecked assumption can change direction very quickly once the records finally catch up. 1 year later, the valley looked peaceful again. The mountains had not changed. The pine forests still covered the ridges. The streams still wound through the ranch exactly as they had when I first arrived. Nature had continued moving forward without the slightest concern for lawsuits, surveys, or court orders. Standing on a hill overlooking the property one autumn evening, I could see just how much had changed for people, even though the landscape appeared almost identical. The villa development still existed, but it no longer carried the same image it once did. What had been presented as an unquestioned success story had become a lesson discussed throughout the region. Following the court's ruling, months of negotiations, title corrections, regulatory reviews, and legal restructuring took place. The process was expensive. It was time-consuming. It forced people to examine records they had ignored for years. Yet eventually, solutions emerged. Property boundaries were formally addressed. Ownership questions were resolved through documented agreements. The uncertainty that once surrounded the development finally disappeared because facts replaced assumptions. The homeowners association survived, but not without consequences. Financial reports revealed costs far greater than residents expected. Projects were postponed. Budgets were adjusted. Community meetings became far more focused on documentation and oversight. The era of simply trusting that everything was correct had ended. As for Linda Crawford, her time as the unquestioned voice of the association quietly came to an end. Months after the ruling, she stepped away from leadership. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle. Just a brief announcement thanking her for years of service before new leadership took over. Looking back, I almost felt sorry for her. The mistake that triggered the entire situation had likely existed long before she became involved. Her real failure was not creating the problem. Her failure was refusing to investigate it once the evidence appeared. Confidence convinced her she already knew the answer. The documents disagreed. I still think about the first survey marker Caleb Morrison pointed out near the southern boundary. That small steel post sat unnoticed for years while thousands of people drove past it without a second glance. Developers overlooked it. Association leaders overlooked it. Residents overlooked it. Yet it never moved. It never changed. It simply waited for someone to ask the right question. Sometimes the smallest details carry the largest consequences. My own life became wonderfully boring again, which was exactly what I wanted. Most mornings started with coffee on the porch while sunlight spread across the ranch. Fence repairs replaced legal meetings. Cattle management replaced court filings. The sound of wind moving through pine trees replaced conversations about surveys and title records. Peace returned because the uncertainty was gone. One evening, shortly before sunset, I drove past the area where the original dispute began. The villas stood quietly against the mountains. Families walked along trails. Children rode bicycles. People enjoyed their lives. Seeing that made me smile. Contrary to what some residents believed early in the conflict, I never wanted the community to fail. I only wanted the truth acknowledged. There is a difference. As the sky turned orange and gold, I stopped near the old boundary marker and looked across the valley. The same marker that started everything remained firmly in place. The same land remained exactly where it had always been. In the end, the court ruling, the surveys, the title reviews, and the deputies all served the same purpose. They forced everyone to return to reality. My grandfather used to say that land never argues. It simply waits for people to stop arguing about it. Standing there in the fading light, I finally understood what he meant. The ranch did not win. The homeowners association did not lose. The records told the truth, and eventually everyone had to live with it. That was the real ending. Not victory, not revenge, just the quiet moment when facts finally became impossible to ignore.